Hello, welcome back to How to Read a Poem. Today, a poem about death, but not a human death, the death of a fly. Do animal lives matter? Why should we be concerned about how we treat animals? After all, aren't we supposed to be superior to animals in certain ways? Don't we have intelligence? Don't we have rationality? How then do we treat animals? How then do we treat the lives of things around us, inhuman things? All these are implicit questions that the poem addresses. The poem is titled A Death to Us by the poet Jon Silkin. It starts very directly. A tiny fly fell down on my page. You might think of page in terms of maybe the page of a book, but perhaps more interestingly, maybe the poet is talking about his own idea of writing. The poet might be writing a poem when suddenly something happens. A tiny fly fell down on the page that the poet is writing on. There's a certain sort of intrusion. Something from the outside disturbs or disrupts the poet's activity, and the poet is forced to take notice. But to take notice of something we might normally brush aside. A tiny fly fell down. The death of something as minuscule, as insignificant as a fly. It fell down on my page, shivered, lay down, and died on my page. Note the use of personification. The fly shivered, the fly lay down, and the fly died. All human traits, all human characteristics. So, all of a sudden, we are forced to consider the death of a fly from a strange human point of view. And this might be the point of the poem as it unfolds itself. So the tiny fly, minuscule, but nevertheless, it has noticeable enough actions to suggest it shivered, it lay down, and it died. The next stanza probes the response of the poet. I threw his body onto the floor that had laid its frail life next to mine. So the response is a very human response in that it's a response of disregard. Note the verb threw. So that attitude of complete disregard, that attitude of carelessly throwing the fly's body onto the floor, disregarding it, chucking it aside, that had laid its frail life next to mine. But the fourth line suggests a sort of implicit connection between the life of the fly and the life of the poet, mine. So, unbeknownst to the poet, some sort of connection, some sort of mysterious link is being forged between the life of that insignificant fly and the life of the poet. They lie side by side. They lie next to each other. Third stanza, his death then became an intrusion on my action. So something intrudes from the outside, the death of the fly. In what way does the fly intrude? In what way does the fly become insignificant? In what way does the death of the fly change from something unnoticeable, from something unmentionable, into something of grave importance? The sixth line provides the clue. He claimed himself as my victim. Look at the word victim. Now, we normally use victim not only in a human context, so in a sense the murderer and his victim, but also in a moral context, and that might be important to see. If the fly is the poet's victim, then the poet is in some sort of way responsible for the death of the fly. He can't just be blasé about it. He can't just completely disregard the effect of the death of the fly on his morality, on his being. So that intrusion is being dramatized as a certain sort of claiming in the sixth line. The fly, although speechless, the fly, although not human, nevertheless claimed himself. Intrudes itself not only in the poet's attention, but also puts upon the poet a certain sort of moral responsibility for his death. He claimed himself as my victim. His speck of body, the fourth stanza, continues this idea of the insignificance, the smallness of the body of the fly. Speck, something small, something minute, something ordinarily not worth a second's consideration. But something so small, paradoxically having such a large impact on the consciousness of the speaker in terms of the word accused. So the body points a finger at the speaker. The speaker is accused. The speaker has, in this sense, to justify his actions, justify why he has allowed, in a sense, the fly to die. His speck of body accused me there without an action of his small brown death. So the speaker is indeed, in this sense, responsible for the death of the fly. The speaker cannot ignore it anymore, cannot ignore the significance it has on the speaker personally. So, smallness, speck of body without an action, without any human action. Nevertheless, that death needs to be something that the poet has to account for. Fifth stanza now, and I think now. So this idea of reflection comes in, this idea of after the fact, the speaker has a sort of understanding of the situation. As I barely perceive him, that his purpose became in dying. So the fly's death isn't meaningless. The fly's death teaches the poet something. The fly's death becomes purposeful, almost as purposeful as the death of a human life. However, again, it's barely perceptible. So again, link all these words together. Barely perceive, speck of body, tiny fly. It gives you an idea. And what is this idea contrasting against? The largeness of the significance of its death. That his purpose became in dying a demand for the murderer of his casual body. So in dying, his death puts on the speaker a moral demand, a need to account who murdered the fly. Animal lives matter too. The poem wants to bring that across. Everything is interconnected. The writing of the poem on the page, the falling of the fly onto the page, the action of the speaker, the action of the poet, and what the death means. All these things are interconnected. All these things speak to humankind's responsibility for creatures who are smaller than us, creatures who are more helpless than us, and therefore this poem provides a way in which the otherwise meaningless, the casual death of the fly becomes dignified. Because when we see the death in moral terms, we also see it in terms of human concerns, human terms. A demand for the murderer of his casual body. So this is what the speaker brings away. So I must give his life a meaning. Note the imperative here, must. That's carried on in the next line. So I must, so I must. Look at the repetition of lines. This technique is known as anaphora. So I must, so I must. That repetition at the start of lines tells us how the fly's death now imposes a sort of burden on the speaker. A burden that speaks to his calling as a poet. So in his vocation as a poet, I must give his life a meaning. Through the writing of the poem, the fly's insignificant death now accrues a meaning. And it is something that he must carry about him. If you're interested, you might note the allusion or the indirect literary reference to Samuel Taylor Coleridge's famous poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, where in that poem, the mariner kills an albatross. But as the poem progresses, the albatross now becomes a burden on the mariner. Visualized in terms of the albatross clinging onto the mariner's back. So here, in an analogous way, the fly clings onto the back of the speaker. So I must carry his death about me like a large fly. So now the fly has progressed from being tiny in the first line to being large at the last line, telling us about the transformation that the poet undergoes in the course of the poem. I must carry his death. I must carry the significance. I must carry the burden of his death. I must carry the burden of my action and my inaction in terms of this largeness of purpose, like a large fly, like a large, frail purpose. The last phrase brings us back to the paradoxical idea of the purpose, of the significance, of the burden of the fly's death being both large and frail. So it's small, but in its smallness, it means everything. So in the writing of the poem, the fly's death not only has become dignified as the death of any Greek hero in the Iliad or the Odyssey, but also probing the sense that in the title, the fly's death is not just an unconnected death, it is, as the title says, a death to us. Not the word us, not only the speaker, not a death to me, but a death to us. In other words, we might say a death to the whole human race. So, the insignificance, the pointlessness of the animal's death gets worked in this poem into something larger, into something that means more. This has been How to Read a Poem. Thank you.